Hello. It's really nice to be here. It's not the normal sort of conference I speak at because I'm not a full-time sysadmin. I wouldn't even call myself a DevOps person, really. So what I am is Managing Director of a two-person company called edgeofmyseat.com. We do a few different things, but most of our time now is spent developing and supporting Perch, which is a product, a content management system. Now, Perch is actually self-hosted. It's not software as a service. So we don't have a requirement for a whole bunch of servers out there, which are, customers hosting sites on. We don't have sort of mission-critical infrastructure that, the world will end if it all keels over. But like any digital business, we have got an infrastructure, and we need to take care of it. But when I mention to people that we're using Puppet and they realise what sort of business we are and the type of service that we're likely to have, people are often quite surprised. I think people out there often feel that Puppet's for great big infrastructures or software as a service companies or people who are spinning up multiple resources out in the cloud. And we've got very little requirements, and maybe they could just be handled more simply. But I really do believe that Puppet can be useful for people in my situation. I found it very useful in my situation, and so this is why I'm talking about this today. In case there are some of you who are from a very small company, or perhaps your contractors and you work for smaller companies, and perhaps sometimes have to try and encourage them, why using some sort of automation, why using Puppet might be a good idea. So I'm going to cover a bit of my background, how I came to be using Puppet in the first place. I'm going to cover a few of the challenges that I faced as someone who isn't a full-time sysadmin in implementing Puppet. I'm going to talk a bit about why it makes sense even for very small infrastructures with a handful of servers. So hopefully, if you're here because you're wondering whether to embrace Puppet, maybe there'll be something here for you. As I say, if you're a consultant and you work with companies of different sizes, then maybe something in the experience I've had will be of use. It might give you some arguments to take to a client who's sort of pushing back a bit on using Puppet. So I run the company with actually my husband. We're a two-person company, we're also husband and wife. Drew is the lead developer on the product, and I am pretty much everything else. So in any given day, I might write a blog post or some help documentation. I'll be definitely doing technical support. The product is self-hosted. I know all about all the bad ways to configure PHP. I spend a lot of time doing things like dealing with VAT and the accounts, working with the bookkeeper. I manage contractors. I fill in endless baffling forms sent to me by the government. I write presentations and do public speaking. I still do quite a bit of PHP development myself. I do front-end development for our sites. And I also have to deal with any of the ops issues that come up and deal with any new servers or any patches to the servers we've got. So I'm far too busy. I'm always far too busy. And even as we start to hand over some of this stuff to other people, I like to have a good overview of what's going on. I don't like to be sort of in the dark with what's happening with any part of our business. And I'm quite an old geek. Actually, this crowd is more my age than the web sort of development conferences I normally speak to. I seem to look out into crowds and they're about the same age as my daughter. It's quite nice not to be in that position for a change. But anyway, I learned web development at the time when if you wanted to, it was Perl really, it was what we were using. And so if you wanted to start learning Perl, what you do is you get yourself a cheap computer. I had the world's worst Compact that some office had got rid of. You installed Linux, I think it was probably Red Hat 5.2, and I started teaching myself Perl. I just worked with the camel book. You had to know quite a bit about doing things like configuring Apache. You had to know quite a bit about Linux just to do web development back then. I think things are an awful lot easier now. There's a lot of ways you can just kind of get started writing code. So because of that, I've always had a bit of an interest in the operations side of things. I've always enjoyed knowing about that stuff. And for a short time, before I started my own business in 2001, I worked for .com companies and kind of headed up technical teams. So I've got a reasonable amount of clue. But I don't get a lot of time to take a deep look into anything these days because there's just so many different parts to my job. So really, I spend a lot of time, I hit a problem and then I try and find out the answer to it. So before we started using Puppet, our infrastructure was a bunch of independent servers, all sort of VPS machines hosted at Memset, and they'd all been set up at different times. Now some of them I'd set up, some of them Drew had set up. Now neither of us wanted to touch the servers that the other person had set up because we were quite scared of what we might have done. Some of them had things like Web Host Manager on them, some of them were very out of date, others were like a complete mystery and nobody dared update them. And so it kind of wasn't great. We weren't having any real problems, but it was a bit worrying. You know, we often had these conversations that started, well, that's one of your machines, you'll have to sort that out. So I try and document what I was doing. I do tend to sort of document things because I'm always sort of hoping I'll be able to hand bits over to contractors and things. But of course what would happen with these machines is I'd document them when I set them up, and I'd try and remember to document them when I changed things. But when something happened at 6 o'clock on a Friday night and I SSH'd in and fixed it, that would never get documented. So over time, things would sort of drift. None of our servers were very complex, and I think that's the same for a lot of small businesses. Nothing's very complex, so you think, oh, it'll probably be all right. You know, it wasn't very difficult to set that server up. If it all goes wrong, you know, we'll be able to get that back working again quite quickly. I think in small businesses, it's always, you know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That's working, so I've got something else to worry about. I've got another baffling form to fill in. I'll not worry about that for now. And I was kind of aware that our systems weren't great, but because it was working and no great catastrophe had occurred, I was just sort of letting it tick along. And then in January 2013, something did break. However, it actually wasn't server related. That's my metalwork. Well, it was. I've actually had to take it back out now. In January 2013, I fell over while running on the ice. Don't do it, it's a bad idea. And I shattered my elbow. I spent 5 days in hospital, and I was pretty much one-handed for a good few months. And while that meant I couldn't do a lot of other things that I normally do in my job, and Drew had to pick up an awful lot of that, and some of our contractors, it did give me some time to spend some time researching. And so I decided to put that time into figuring out what we were going to do about our infrastructure. So I wouldn't suggest anything dramatic like breaking bones as the best way to get started learning Puppet, but it gave me that time to read and research and get over the initial hurdle of just understanding how this stuff worked. So I quickly discovered this concept of, you know, automating servers and its infrastructure as code. And I really liked the idea of that. As a developer, this idea of being able to check our infrastructure into source control and knowing what it was and have it all documented and have commit logs, that sounded like a really, really great idea. So that kind of led to my first choice. Should it be Chef or Puppet? And that was, you know, pretty much what I was looking at the time. Now, I chose Puppet in a very scientific method. I chose it really because the docs looked better, and I started looking around the community, and I thought, this tool's got a really nice community around it. And you know, I've kind of grown up on Usenet, so I'm used to sort of defending myself and being told to RTFM. But a friendly community is a real plus point, especially when you know you've got limited time. So I did, like I'm sure a lot of people have done. I started to work through the Learning Puppet material with the virtual machine, typing one-handed at the time. And I'd really recommend using the Learning Puppet series if you are just getting into this. It really helps, and I think the new stuff looks even better. And when I started to learn Puppet, it was before the new training videos that are available in the Puppet Labs workshop. But these are really excellent. I've pointed Drew to these so he can figure out sort of how our infrastructure goes together now that I tend to look after it. And I also go back and look at them because things change very quickly in Puppet. That's probably my biggest challenge really, is that every time I come back to it, things have changed and moved on. I feel like I've got something new to learn. So the videos are really helpful for that, to get an overview. And I started out by looking at small things. So rather than just try and, you know, rebuild everything at once, I thought, well, you know, what are the pain points that I've got? So one of the things I'd always have to look up is, you know, how to set up SSH access for like our deployments. And I thought, well, that'd be really great if I could automate that, and then when I've got a new server, we'll be able to deploy to it and it'll just work. So to get started, it often really is, you know, as a small business, it's just a case of finding all those things that you have to look up. All those things you've got like a notebook with some notes in, these are the steps I follow to do this. Well, you can kind of do that with Puppet and it will do it for you. And this was really great. So there's lots of little things like setting up cron jobs and users and SSH keys and vhost if you're hosting websites. There's like config files. In our case, there's always sort of PHP in here or whatever. And installing packages that you always have on every server. You can do all that with Puppet in a very small way without kind of going wholesale into it. So for instance, we can install packages, and most of you are already using Puppet. I saw the sort of hands up earlier, so you know this stuff. And you can set up cron jobs. I find that really useful. That's something that I never remember how to do, so it's great. I can just put it now into my manifest. And you can ensure that certain configuration files are exactly as you expect, and you haven't got some other file from somewhere else or contains version. So if you're thinking about using Puppet right now and you're really busy and it's just another job you've got to do, don't wait until you've got the time, because we never ever have the time. Just see where there's little ways that Puppet can actually save you some time now, make things more reliable and make things quicker, and build from there. Now, due to the fact that we were hosted on inexpensive VPS boxes that I can cancel at any time and bring up new ones, I did eventually move each of our servers in turn over to a fully Puppet managed configuration. However, that process took a few months as I tackled one server at a time. And I definitely made a few mistakes as I was trying to get my head around all of this. So the first thing was, I started, I'd gone through the learning VM, I knew how to write modules, I kind of understood the language, I'd learned a bit of Ruby, I'm a PHP developer, so Ruby was all new to me. So the first thing I did was I felt like I had to write all my code myself, I had to write all my own modules. It was a sort of hefty dose of not invented here was going on. So I was writing an Apache and MySQL module. And I was running into trouble and then Googling. And what I was finding when I was searching was I kept coming back to the official Puppet Labs Apache module or whatever. And so then I'm reading through that and trying to work out how to implement that in my own. And of course this was absolutely crazy. Because it was useful having that experience in writing modules, and obviously you are going to have to write some of your own stuff. But by sort of ignoring all this wonderful code that was already written, I was actually wasting quite a lot of time. So once I started to become more comfortable with the modules, I started using modules from the Puppet Forge to do standard things and save my writing of modules for things which were very specific to our environment. Now Gary mentioned in his talk, the first thing, that there are now Puppet supported modules on the Puppet Forge. And I think actually that would have given me an awful lot more confidence to use the other people's code when I got started, because I wasn't quite sure, what things were doing, I guess, at first, and that's why I'd sort of been led to write my own stuff, so I knew what was going on. The fact there are now Puppet supported modules, I think, would probably give someone like me a lot more confidence to go out there and use somebody else's code, knowing that it's supported, and knowing that somebody else has looked over and checked what it's doing. So if you need to do something like configure Apache, it makes absolute sense to use the Puppet Labs Apache module. That gives you a robust module, it's going to be supported across lots of different platforms. And the second place I really struggled, and to some extent I still struggle with, was in understanding how to version control this setup. Because I was using these modules from the Forge, and I couldn't figure out how best to deal with those in Git. And I did end up at one point trying to use Git submodules and ended up in this horrendous mess of stuff, and I don't want to do that again. So ultimately I've ended up installing the modules with the Puppet module tool and committing them with everything else. It's actually become less of an issue, because when I first started, the modules that I was using were less mature. And there were times when I'd either find a bug in them and I'd want to fix it, or they'd just not have something configurable that I needed to set. As things like the Apache module has become more mature, you can set all of the configuration options. So I've not ended up with kind of my own fork of a standard module in the way I did. So I'm kind of not 100% happy about this mixture of my code and other people's code then getting committed into source control. If anyone has got a good solution to that, I'll be around at lunch, you can come and tell me, I'd love to know. But that's something that I'd sort of really struggled with, I guess, conceptually as well. And I think, like most people, I was constantly being tripped up by dependencies and ordering. That still catches me out sometimes. many baffling things occurred until I got the simple fact through my head that your Puppet manifests describe how the server is going to end up. They're not a kind of step-by-step guide that Puppet follows to make it so. And the link here is to a blog post by Gary, who opened the conference, and it's a good explanation for the baffled of how dependencies and order work. As I say, that still kind of catches me out every now and again. So it's getting on for 2 years since I broke my elbow and started to learn about Puppet. So where are we now with this? Now I'm going to show you this next stuff, not so you can take tips from me. My best advice is don't take tips from a sysadmin who spends 2 hours a week doing it. But I wanted to kind of show you some of the stuff I'm doing to give some context, and also to show you what's doable in a very limited time. So for the last year or so, this is kind of the setup. All of these servers are now fully managed by open source Puppet. I periodically export things into local VMs to check I can still rebuild it with the name of fuss. So I've got a Puppet master, which also has PuppetDB on the same box. There's 3 web servers which run various sites that sell and support our product. And there's a web server that's the demo server, which I'll talk a little bit about in a minute, because that's kind of doing the most interesting thing. For monitoring, we use Scout, which is a software as a service monitoring tool, which I really like. It's a bit more lightweight than sort of New Relic, which I did try and use, and I never really kind of got my head around how the plugins and things worked. I also have Puppet Board installed, which gives me some visual output from PuppetDB and lets me see what's going on. So the web servers use Puppet Labs modules for things like Apache and MySQL and anything else standard. And I've got a module hosting which has got a bunch of stuff in it that's common to all of our web servers. And there's some additional manifests which deal with things that aren't on all of the servers. For instance, one of the servers has got things like Beanstalk running for a queue. I make an awful lot of use of Hyra. And I think I'd almost kind of backed out of using Puppet until I discovered Hyra, because I found the idea of including sort of variable data in my manifest just really, really odd. And I think that's because the time that I started using Puppet, Puppet 3 was new. I've always used Puppet 3, and I think Hyra you had to install in Puppet 2. So there was lots and lots of example code that seemed to have really specific stuff, just like deep in manifests. And I didn't like the idea of that. I felt that was going to get confusing. And I was searching for how best to store variable data and be able to reuse modules properly. And it was in doing that that I discovered Hyra. And really, it was once I got my head around Hyra as a concept that I really felt that I could be using Puppet properly. So you'll probably see some other examples today, but I thought I'd just show you how we're using that. So the great thing for a small company like mine with Hyra is if I bring up a new server with our standard config, both Drew and I have got immediate access configured in the same way as all the other servers. So we can get into the server and we can do stuff. So that's really handy. And then for server-specific information, I have a node-specific YAML file, and that just has in things for that server. So things like extra users maybe, or all the sort of sites that are going to be on that server, and the databases and so on. I can use a node-specific YAML file. So we might just define one backend using YAML, state where the data directory is, and then declare the hierarchy. So I've got a file that's the basic domain name, host name for that node, and then my common YAML, which has got the things in which all the servers have on them. So things in your common YAML file get compiled together with things in that node-specific file. So this is kind of useful for things like, if I've got a contractor working for us and he needs access to one of the boxes, obviously all of the servers have myself and Drew have access, but I can add his details, his user account, to that node-specific one. They all get compiled together, and then he has access just to that one box. That's really useful, it's really time-saving. We know exactly how each box is configured and who has access. I can do things like update SSH keys just in one place in the YAML file. It doesn't matter how many servers they might be used from. If we did start to have a lot more servers, they'd be exactly the same. And I find the YAML is much easier to read through than a manifest to answer questions like who has access to this server and which sites are hosted on box A, for instance. I'm aware there are issues with using create resources heavily. This is a really good post by Gary on using Hira in anger. It explains a lot of the potential pitfalls of doing so. I think the reason it works so well in my situation is because we're very small. And I'm very keen on maintaining those YAML files as the sort of source of truth of what's on the servers and avoiding specifying resources elsewhere. And I can do that because basically it's me who edits this stuff. Drew might go and edit one of the YAML files to change something, but generally it's me who writes the Puppet code, so I can kind of, have it as I want it like that. I can understand why using create resources you may well end up with stuff being added to servers that you're not quite sure about. That's a really useful blog post though, and it certainly made me think about how I've got things set up. But this usage of Hira allows me to do something very useful that's very specific to our environment. So most of the infrastructure I've shown you is really, really simple. It's very basic web hosting setup, really. Slight differences between servers depending on what's on them. So there's one place where we are doing something very interesting with Puppet, and somewhere that Puppet solved a real problem for us. As I say, Perch is self-hosted. We don't have servers hosting user data, we don't host other people's websites. But what we do have is a bunch of live demos for Perch. And we wanted these to be a really great introduction to the product. Now, if you look at a lot of CMS products, open source and commercial, what they'll do is they'll have one single demo. And it'll have like a password, username and password and you log in. And everyone who's looking at that server can log in at the same time, and they can change things and play around. So you get things where people are posting abusive stuff, or people are trying to break things, people are just like editing the stuff that somebody else who's trying out the demo is adding. And also everything's refreshed maybe an hour or so you can't set something up for someone who's trying the system out and then show your client. So what I wanted to do was give demo users a clean setup of a live site and leave it up there for say 3 days so that they could log in, they could make changes, they could play around with how it worked, they could maybe show a potential client, this is the CMS we want to use. That's what I wanted to do. So essentially it was almost like setting up a mini shared hosting environment. So this is our demo sign-up page, and people can sign up, but there's actually 3 different demos, 3 different sites you can sign up for. And what happens behind the scenes if you fill in this, the request gets logged in our database. We've got a system we call Air Traffic Control that controls all the customer account type stuff. And so then we have a script that runs on the Puppet Master, and it writes a JSON file of live demos. And this JSON file is used to second Hira backend. As I mentioned in my brief look at Hira, you can have multiple backends, not just using YAML, but you can also use JSON. So a new entry triggers a Puppet run which deploys any new site, and it also cleans up any expired ones. So then I've got this module which deploys the sites, and it controls various things about the setup of the demo server and the deployments on it. So to actually deploy a site, it finds the relevant tarball of site files and SQL dump of data. The vhost gets created, that file gets unzipped and put into the home directory. We replace that a bunch of variables to customize both the SQL script and the config file for Perch, and then we import that SQL file. We can then notify the main server that those demos are ready to go, and the potential customer gets an email saying, here they are, and these are your unique login details. So as far as Puppet is concerned, that JSON Hira backend is the source of truth as to which site should be running at any one time. It's quite nice for us because it means that demo server, which is a slight worry to me because you've got people who are able to upload stuff to different things. I don't want that touching any other data, anything else on the infrastructure. I want it to be an independent thing that just runs demos. There's other good things about this. If we want to, say, extend a demo for someone, we just update that in the main database, and then that stays in the JSON file until the time it expires and gets taken out again. We can also do stuff, if we had a real run on demos, we could quite easily deploy these to multiple servers, because we're writing that JSON file on the Puppet Master. We could write to several servers if suddenly we were swamped by people who want to try out our product. It would be lovely. And it's pretty robust as a system. when we started doing this, we ran into various issues of like data that shouldn't get into the JSON file getting into the JSON file, and it would cause Puppet to trip up and it wouldn't run. But that kind of didn't matter because Puppet just deploys the sites that are in that JSON file. So if it wasn't going out for an hour or so, I'd have a look, I'd fix it. Once it was working again, all the correct sites were deployed, and people just waited a bit longer to get their demo, and it was fine. So it's very robust. It's not broken for a long time. Once we figured out, how to make sure that the data that got into there was fine. We do sort of 50 or 60 of these sites a day, and it just runs really nicely. So I would say, start small with these Puppet implementations, and you can see what a difference in your time automating a few simple things can make. But there are ways that you can take it further. Prior to doing this with Puppet, we had a kind of string of PHP scripts that made demos live, which was incredibly fragile. And if it broke, we had kind of no way to know, who's had their sites provisioned. We'd have to sort of pick it all apart through the server and figure out at which point it had gone wrong, and try and make sure that everyone got a demo to look at. Now it just feels very robust, even if it does break. Provisioning the demos is actually just one half the issue that Puppet's solving for me, because the other issue that we had was in keeping them up to date. Because if we update Perch, we need to update all the demos, which causes changes to the SQL script. And so what I was having to do was then spend a day searching and replacing through SQL scripts to swap out placeholders for the data that then gets replaced so that it becomes unique for that person. I'm actually doing all of that now in VM with Vagrant. I sort of round trip the SQL scripts and create the tarballs, which I can then transfer onto the demo server ready to go out. So that's kind of handy. So something that was taking me a day of searching and replacing and testing now takes me about 30 minutes when we want to update the demo to the latest version of Perch. So that's a little bit of how I got to be using Puppet in the first place and some of the things that we use it for. And so I wanted to share with you the reasons why I think that Puppet is a great choice for small companies. Why should they be using Puppet? Why would you recommend that a client or an organization uses Puppet even if they're quite small? So I think a lot of companies, small companies who don't have permanent ops staff, do live in great fear of something going wrong. When you're not a systems administrator full time, you kind of know that your self-taught knowledge is only going to get you so far, so you live in a bit of fear of things going wrong. And small companies often actually don't need hugely redundant infrastructures, especially if you're not software as a service. Now, if we go offline for, say, half a day, people will grumble on Twitter. They'll not be able to buy licenses, which would be a bit of a shame for us as a company. Our support forums will be down, so yes, so people will be emailing us and complaining on Twitter. But it wouldn't really damage our business, not being down for a few hours. People aren't relying on our servers being accessible to run their business. They're relying on them to be able to get support and things, but we can do that another way if we have to. So the important thing really is that everything can be restored. So we've always kept good backups, we care about that, of course, and so you've got backups, and so yes, we could have cobbled our infrastructure back together again. It would have probably taken quite a long time, because we would have had to rebuild all the servers one at a time, we'd have had to try and remember what went where, and then we'd have had to start reconfiguring every site and every service that ran on them, one thing at a time. I'm not sure how long that would have taken. I think it would have taken a very long time, even for 5 or 6 servers. And it's very fragile, this kind of situation, and it's a situation that a lot of small businesses are in. I mean, through the product that we have, we speak to a lot of people who run small businesses, and I know the sort of sketchy state that their infrastructures are in all the time. So now we've got our server configurations held in code and in source control, and generally using standard modules from Puppet Forge, we could be up and running again very quickly. And we'd know as well that the new servers were configured in just the same way as the old servers. So the time to get all that live again would be minimized, and the time spent sort of dealing with that situation would be reduced. And given that if something like that's going to go wrong, it's going to happen when you're already massively overstretched, and most small businesses, you're just overstretched, that's just how you are. That's really, really important. I like to try periodically to sort of restore servers locally, set it all up in a bunch of vagrant boxes, just to check that our configuration and our backups are as I would expect them to be. And that's a really useful tip if you're sort of doing this stuff, is just, can you get it all back up, and how quickly can you do that? So the other thing is that having infrastructure as code is absolute magic for the small business owner. Because if ops is only one tiny part of your job, you find that you do something, you perform some action, you set up something on servers, and you don't have to do it again for ages. You don't configure another server for 3 months. So when you come back to have to configure another server, you're like, oh, how do we do that again? How do we set this up? How do we set up SSL certificates, whatever it is? You have to try and remember how to do that. So with Puppet, we've essentially documented these processes by way of the manifests. If something gets onto a server, other than the base Debian install, it got there by way of a Puppet manifest. So those things are readable. We can see what has been done. No one has changed anything on those servers other than through the Puppet manifests. We've also got the Git history, because if I've added something to a manifest, then I can look at the commit comments in Git to see why on earth I did that. And so I'm fairly careful to document if I do anything that's non-obvious. Now, I actually really enjoy doing this stuff. It's part of my job. I certainly much more than filling in forms for the government. But as a business owner, it's probably not sensible for me to carry on doing this forever, because it's actually quite a nice, particularly now we're all in Puppet, it's quite a nice package of work that I can hand over to somebody else. So we're probably going to look to bring in some outside help. And because we've only got a few servers, that probably doesn't need to be a full-time operations person. It might be someone who perhaps is a freelancer contractor and does a day a week. So it would make it very easy, I think, for us to now start handing things over. And if we had to bring in someone at short notice, because of maybe some issue that I couldn't solve myself, the setup for every single server is there. It's detailed as code and how we got to that point. And I think that's a really important thing for small business. If I can't be doing this anymore, I can hand it over to somebody else. And they're going to be able to see what I did, when I did it, why I did it. That wouldn't have been the case a couple of years ago. As I say, Drew and I were worried to touch each other's servers because neither of us knew what the other had done. I do most of this stuff, but if I go and break some other bone while doing some crazy sporting activity, and Drew needed to dive in and have a look at it, well, it's all there for him to see. You can see what's happened, you can see what the servers I've configured, and how they've been configured. I think this is really important for small businesses, because you're quite likely not to have a full-time ops person. You're probably going to use a contractor or a freelance, and you're probably still going to do some stuff yourself, so having all this stuff in code is really, really useful. And even when you are at the point where you've got someone on staff dealing with this stuff, keeping the infrastructure managed by Puppet and keeping it all in code means that if that key employee leaves, you don't lose their knowledge of how things are configured. And that is really valuable. So I think small businesses are far more exposed than larger ones, because they usually just have one person on a team who is the source of all the knowledge of this stuff. And that person might not even be full-time. So if the work they're doing on the servers is there in code and source control, it's going to be much easier for it to be taken over by someone else, even if there isn't a proper handover. I think that's a kind of a really important point, because if you've got these tiny businesses, people just move around quite quickly, and you can say to someone, oh, make sure you document what you're doing, but does that really happen? I'm fairly careful about this stuff, and I don't document everything I do, and so you don't know whether the employee's doing it. Something I don't do so much anymore, because when we used to do client work, sometimes I'd be involved with clients who needed to say, meet the PCI compliance for storing card data and things. I can imagine that having all this stuff in Puppet is going to make those kind of audits so much easier when you're asked what's on these servers, how are they set up. I've certainly read information from other people saying that they found the auditors have been perfectly happy just to look at the Puppet manifests and modules to see what settings are being applied to the servers. And configuration drift is a huge problem if your servers need to be held to some kind of standard. and Puppet is obviously perfect for making sure that drift doesn't happen. And there's plenty of very small businesses that are having to meet very stringent requirements like this. And I like to be able to do everything as fast as possible because I've got too much to do. So Puppet makes it just easy for me to set up new servers. When I decide I want to set up a new server for some specific task, I get a new mini server from Memset with Debian installed, and I can then very, very quickly just add that to the group and install all our basic web server stuff, because they use web servers, and configure initial sites and databases in Highway. It takes a few minutes, and I know exactly what I've got when I'm finished. Being able to do this stuff quickly and accurately means I don't need to spend any extra time or thought in getting that new server ready for whatever task I'm going to put it to. In the past, setting up new servers was always a kind of sticking point for me. I knew it would take a bit of time. I'd have to remember how to do all this stuff. And now I can be up and running, you know, with my first cup of coffee. And that means that setting up like a temporary server in our infrastructure, perhaps so that an outside contractor can work on something, that becomes so much easier. And so I think we can do things in an awful more secure way, because I can say, well, you've got access to this server, put what you want on it, or whatever, you know, do whatever, and I know I can just tear it down again later. A real benefit to us, and a sort of slightly non-obvious benefit, I think, because it's related to how we're set up, we can take advantage of the fact that the mini server packages at our hosting company are really quite volatile. So if I take out a cheap mini server and it's 50 quid, in 4 months' time, I might find that the same package is 20 quid cheaper a month, or it's got loads more memory or something. And in the past, that would just kind of annoy me. I'd be like, that's annoying that we're paying more for that server than we would if we took it out now. These days, I can just say, let's replace that server, let's cancel that package, take out a new one, and actually just replace it, and get a cheaper server or more resources on the server for the same money. That works really well. And with working with a lot of people who provide design services through what we do for Perch, I know from experience that a lot of small businesses end up stuck on really terrible ancient hosting just because moving everything is just too terrifying. Just the thought of shifting all that stuff is scary. And with Puppet, it's not really, you know, it's just, that's another job to do, it's quite simple. So it makes those decisions a lot easier. It would certainly mean that if, I mean, we love our hosts, we love Memset, they're great, but if they went terrible at some point, they got bought out and the service really went downhill, for instance, it wouldn't be a big deal for us to move somewhere else. I feel very secure in the fact that if our hosting goes appalling, we'll just up and move somewhere else. We didn't have that sort of safeguard before. I mentioned earlier my initial battles with not invented here syndrome and the modules from the Forge. However, I'm now very happy to rely on those, to lean on other people's code, well-tested code, people who know a lot more about this stuff than I do. I think that's great for someone who's very time constrained. I treat the modules on the Forge as my first port of call. You know, has someone else already written this stuff? And only then, and only if the module is something very specific to us, do I write my own thing. It's great if I'm asked to configure something that I don't know a lot about. Our contractor wants to use some packages for queuing and things that I didn't know about. And there were packages there on the Forge that installed them, and I could read through and find out what they were doing, what they were setting, and start to explore a bit about, to learn about what those packages were, and that I didn't know anything about. So that was really useful. And when I do write my own modules, the fact there are all these modules out there that are really well written and supported by Puppet, I can use those as an example of best practice and figure out how to do things. So that's really helpful to me as well. And finally, I think a big reason to be using Puppet is I've been hanging around open source and technical communities since about '96. I actually met my husband on Usenet. So I'm kind of used to the nature of these communities. I'm not someone who worries about posting stuff and getting a load of grumpy responses, whatever, you know? But having somewhere to ask questions is really important when you're not an expert. And small companies often have people like me who aren't experts who are in charge of this stuff, and we have to come and ask questions when we get stuck. The Puppet community always stands out as a really friendly place to ask those questions. It's a big part of why I chose Puppet in the first place, and I know there are people out there who are happy to help and not just call me an idiot when I've got something wrong. So for that reason, I advise anyone to go with Puppet rather than Alternative, because that friendliness and openness to beginners, and for people who aren't coming from a traditional ops background, that's really valuable. And I think it really says a lot about Puppet Labs, the fact they work to curate that environment, have things like the code of conduct. That's, to me, I think that's really important. So on that note, I shall finish. I think I'm about on time. I'll put my slides up at that link. I'm not an expert, as I say, so you probably want to ask questions of someone who is rather than me, but I'm very happy to answer anything now or afterwards, and I'm looking forward to learning more from everyone here today. Thank you. There's one there.
Yeah, kind of half comment, half question. I was interested in your assertion that small businesses don't really need to worry about redundancy and things like that. My experience has been that tools like Puppet make it so easy to do that it's kind of no-brainer. But your experience is obviously different. So I was just wondering what's led you to that conclusion that redundancy isn't important.
I think obviously in a perfect world, we're going to be able to spin up this stuff. And I've actually got a sort of a setup at Linode, which I could use as to switch to if everything goes pear-shaped. But what I mean by that is it's probably that for most small businesses spending a lot of money to have, like a mirrored environment somewhere else and so on, maybe isn't their sort of top thing. And if you're not sort of software as a service and people aren't relying on those servers to run their business, it's kind of like levels, isn't it? It's saying, well, could we be back up again in 2 hours? Versus could we be back up again in 10 minutes? Or, do you know what I mean? I think if you're smaller, you're probably less worried about small amounts of downtime. Whereas, if you've got a lot of people, if you're, I don't know, Xero.com and everyone's doing all their financial data on your servers or whatever, that's very different. Or if you're, if you're a CMS where you're software as a service and everybody's websites are hosted by you, that's a big deal if you go down because nobody's doing any business because you're down. Whereas for us, all of our customers, they take it and they deploy it on their own terrible PHP web hosting. So we don't kind of have that. We're not the sort of the broken link in the chain if something happens to us. I mean, obviously, I think at the most we've had an hour's downtime, and that was actually network related to our hosting company rather than us. But to me, I'd like to make sure we can get up quickly somewhere else rather than just being able to flick a switch. I think if we started offering more kind of software as a service type things, that would change quite quickly. It's really having to do with the type of business we are as opposed to being so small.
Thank you. You mentioned about your customers deploying your app on their terrible hosting companies. Have you reached the point where you have a manifest for them to download to do the deployment?
I haven't. I've built a sort of a vagrant box to help, because the other thing they do is they all use things like MAMP and XAMPP and these things, and then they come into support with problems with MAMP and I have to debug them. So I wish they were all using vagrant, but they're not. But I did build a little setup so people could do that and do that locally. The problem is that people have just got really poor working practices out there in sort of web design community land. So yes, I spend a lot of time doing support when I'm not doing this.
One more question.
Very quickly, the managing your Puppet modules up the librarian Puppet, I find works quite well.
Yeah, it's sort of on my radar. I haven't really looked into it. That's something you're using, is it?
Yeah, it's pretty simple. You just install one gem, and then if you've ever used Bundler for Ruby, it's a guy who takes it to go module blah.
Cool.
It supports GitHub URL, so if there's a module you want to fit, support the repo, fix it, and then point to the back one. So it's not
Cool.
that big a task.
Yeah, it's a librarian Puppet. That's something else I knew was there, but I haven't quite got to look at yet. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.